Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Welcome back to the podcast. New listeners, old listeners, wherever you are in the world, it is so great to have you here back for another episode as we, of course, break down the psychology of our 20s. This episode today, as so many of my favorite episodes are, was actually suggested by a listener called Josephine, who sent me this message. And she's given me permission to read it out loud and see if any of you may relate. This is what she had to say. Hi Gemma, it's been a while since I felt any kind of emotion, and I'm not trying to sound dramatic, I mean truly. Happiness, sadness, excitement, they've all disappeared. My childhood dog recently died and I felt nothing. I got a big promotion that I've wanted for a long time, also nothing. One emotion I am feeling is fear that I'll never feel the same way again. I can link it back to some really bad anxiety I had almost a year ago. Around that time, I started to intellectualize almost all of my emotions before I allowed myself to fully feel them. And now, I feel like I've ruined my brain by cutting off its pathway to expression permanently. Please, any advice I need and would love for you to do an episode on how to actually feel my feelings. So I got this message, and firstly, thank you Josephine for sharing, but I got this message and I immediately knew I needed to talk about this. In fact, I actually had a whole other episode planned for this week, but this one just felt so much more like important because Josephine, like me too, I am here with you. I'm experiencing the same kind of emotional blunting and the same kind of poor communication between me and my emotions. You know, I feel happiness and I confuse it as something bad. I feel sadness, grief, anger, stress. I push it down and say I'll get to that later. I also, much like you, intellectualize my emotions as a way of getting out of feeling them. You know, overanalyzing every possible cause, explanation, and consequence until I'm exhausted. And you know what? I don't feel particularly good about it, and I don't feel like it's a particularly great way to live. The absence of any negative emotions doesn't necessarily make your life a happy one, because your emotions all use the same systems. All 34,000 distinct emotions There's a mobile. 34,000 distinct emotions we can feel are operating across the same neural pathways, across all the same cortexes of the brain. And that's why nostalgia and regret feel so similar. Passion and anger, trust and vulnerability, anxiety and excitement, grief and gratitude, they feel very similar. So you turn off one, you turn off regret, you turn off anger, vulnerability, anxiety, grief. You also turn off nostalgia. You also turn off passion, trust, excitement, gratitude. And I think a lot of us are finding ourselves in that very position where we've tried to manage our negative emotions in a way that's actually meant we've prevented any intense emotion at all. I think a reason for that is that we're scared not of our actual emotions, we're scared of our feelings about our feelings. Like, let me explain this. I know it sounds like a little bit strange, but you know, if I feel sad, I feel like that's a bad thing and I feel like it's the end of the world. If I'm angry, I worry that something is wrong with me. So it's not that the sadness is bad. It's not that the grief or the anger is bad. It's that I believe that it's going to make me feel miserable or have some further on consequence. This whole experience, this whole pattern, this is known as metacognition or meta-emotions. My emotions, our emotions, about the possibility of certain emotions. And if that sounds complicated to you, it most certainly is, and it's complicated for our brain, and it's difficult for us to work through that and feel like we can actually feel our feelings. So the two big questions we're really left with is why? You know, why does this happen, and how do I fix it? How do I convince myself I'm not at the mercy of my emotions and actually let them back in and feel human and feel connected again? Well, my lovely listeners, we are going to discuss exactly that. We are going to explore the psychology behind all of this and so much more. Be prepared to go deep, maybe shed a few tears, because Today I really want us to all leave feeling in touch with at least one emotion we've been suppressing. Just one. That's all I want at the end of the day. So without further ado, let's get into it. So we need to talk about this first. We need to talk about what being detached from our emotions actually looks like. I was about to say, what does it feel like? But, that's the actual problem we're dealing with. What does it look like? Not being able to feel your feelings essentially means you've put up some kind of wall between you and the actual feeling. So it's not necessarily the absence of any emotion at all. You are not broken. The emotions are still there. It's just that when an emotion comes up, you might feel it for just a second. Perhaps you notice it, and then you start overanalyzing, or you get freaked out that it's going to come out too large and too loud. So you distract yourself or minimize or adopt any number of coping strategies. After long enough, you can no longer name what the sensation or emotion even is. And in some extreme cases, you might also take direct action to completely avoid the trigger. If someone has hurt you or broken your heart, you would perhaps consider and tell yourself, well, they don't even exist anymore, and I'm never going to think about them again. Meaning that a lot of the, deep grief or betrayal or the emotions that you should be working through because of that experience remain unhealed, remain untouched. Maybe you're really struggling because you got a terrible grade on a uni assignment and you're such a perfectionist and this is just the most awful thing. You might try and manage that and not feel the feeling by completely disengaging with your studies altogether or completely ignoring any upcoming assignments because you don't even want to give the illusion of trying. So this is known as avoidance, and it's often a precursor to not feeling your feelings, not even putting yourself in the circumstances or the situations in which that might even be possible. So when you feel out of touch with your feelings, when you're experiencing numbness, maybe a delayed emotional response, so something bad happens, you don't really think about it until a month down the line, when you are avoiding emotional situations, when you're experiencing apathy, when you feel like, yes, you may not have been sad for a while, but you also haven't been happy. There is a word for this. It's called emotional blunting, or in medicine, reduced effect display. The best description I've heard of that describes what emotional blunting really is, it actually came from a patient involved in a case study on this experience. And this patient was experiencing intense emotional numbing and blunting, and she said, often what this makes me feel like is I feel invisible, I feel like I'm a ghost, I watch my family engaging with each other, but there is an invisible barrier that keeps me from joining them. This was what another individual had to say in a similar article. The world around me often seems incredibly superficial, like I am simply going through the motions and can't connect to my environment. If I was to reach out and touch that wall, or reach out and swim in the ocean, I wouldn't be able to feel it entirely. So that is what happens when you cannot feel your feelings. You just feel like both of these descriptions from two different patients, two different clients, talk about something between them and the real world, something that has been put there a long time ago, or because of a situation that they didn't feel like they can control. So let's talk about the reasons why we may get to a place of being unable to connect with our emotions. The first one that is very present is being stuck in survival mode or experiencing chronic stress. Now you may hear that and think, I'm not chronically stressed. I'm going to skip this section. I'm fine. I'm not burnt out. I'm fine. You might not even realize that you are, because recent research suggests that around 7 out of 10 of the people listening are chronically stressed. I'm going to say that again, 70%. When I heard that, and actually I heard it in Mel Robbins' new book, I was shocked, but the more I thought about it, I wasn't surprised. Our brains were designed for a very different world than the one we currently live in. We were really designed for a slower, less stimulating, less intense lifestyle. And nowadays, when we are constantly being bombarded with information, with a constant to-do list, productivity guilt, and then let's add on financial instability, uncertainty about the future, and oh no, you're in your 20s, so you need to have it all figured out right now. That sounds exhausting, because it is, and it takes a lot of mental resources to ensure that we don't just collapse in on ourselves like a dying star. Something has to give in those situations. It takes a lot of brain power and willpower to keep up with that much mental activity. And sometimes our brain thinks, well, if we can just dull our emotions for a little bit, if we can shut down our emotional processing systems, well, amazing, that's great. That's one less thing to worry about while we get out of survival mode. Obviously, that's not sustainable. The reason many people end up in this state even after the stress has passed is because when they do allow themselves to feel their emotions, they are so intense after so many months or years of not feeling them that we kind of forget what it means to truly feel. And the best word I can say is it's intense. And so we fall into a bad cycle of feeling safer in our detached state because we are out of practice. We are out of practice with feeling. And so it's easier to revert to the other extreme of nothingness because, the whole system has now become dysregulated, where the presence of even a slight emotion feels so profound after lack of exposure. So I just said this one key word here, dysregulated. Again, your emotional processing systems are still there. It's not like someone has gone into your brain and scooped out a part of your cortex and been like, cool, now you can't feel anything anymore. It's dysregulation of a system that is still present and active. So why has this dysregulation occurred other than chronic stress? Well, maybe it won't come as a surprise that it does begin way back in childhood for many of us. Not all of us, but I think the majority of you can relate to the following series of events. So as children, when we were angry, frustrated, trying to be heard, trying to get our point across, crying out of pain or sadness or exclusion, we were often shut down, either in subliminal or very obvious ways. We were hushed, we were scolded, we were yelled at, even punished. I remember one time, I think I must have been 6 years old, and I don't know, we were on the playground, someone pushed me, I was feeling excluded. We were playing some game and everyone kept running away from me, and I was really, really sad about it, and I felt so lonely, and I went up to a teacher, and I'm sure I was annoying her, I'm sure I was annoying her, but I was crying to her, being no one wants to play with me, no one wants to be my friend, and she was ugh, get over it, just go away and get over it, life is unfair. And that's a distinct part of my memory. And those reactions, the reactions we have of parents, teachers, adults in our lives, is one of the primary ways we learn what is and isn't appropriate when it comes to our emotional reactions. And unfortunately, we often end up learning that big emotions aren't acceptable and may even result in an uncomfortable outcome or a bad outcome for us from those repeated experiences, because if it happened once, I'm sure it happened again and again. We actually begin to deny those emotions ourselves, and over time, that act of suppressing our feelings becomes an unconscious automatic process. We don't need someone else to do it for us. And eventually you don't even realize that you're doing it. Let me give you some of those unconscious ways we still revert to suppress our emotions that you might not even realize you're doing. The first one, and I think this is massive, major, huge in our 20s, abusing alcohol to dampen our anxiety, dampen our insecurity, our fear, or our stress. This one is, I think, the most popular for people in their 20s because drinking is so socially acceptable, but alcohol is also, I'm going to say this and I don't want it to be misconstrued. Alcohol is a fantastic way to not feel your emotions, and it's a fantastic way in the moment to feel less stressed and to feel a little bit happier and to have that buzz in the moment. Afterwards, you begin to associate those happy momentary feelings with the alcohol, and you start pursuing the buzz over and over again, meaning that obviously alcohol takes such a toll on your brain, such a toll on your body, but also you have this huge catalog of memories and experiences that just go untouched and unprocessed, but don't go away. So alcohol is one of the ways that we manage not feeling our feelings. The other one is overworking. You feel a negative feeling come up, you immediately start working, you start working late, you commit to more and more things. That feels satisfying in many ways and is, again, socially acceptable in today's hustle culture. Does it mean you process your emotions? No, it doesn't. It's just a distraction. This next one is also one that probably a lot of you can relate to, especially during this generation, and it's escapism through TV shows or social media. I was having a conversation with someone recently where, we were talking about death and we were talking about grief. And as it was getting rather heavy, we were both sharing, we were both bonding. She picked up her phone and she started aimlessly scrolling and playing TikToks out loud. And I was it wasn't rude. I was just oh, I'm so sorry, let's stop talking about this. If you want to talk about something else, I totally get it. And she looked up from her phone and she was really surprised. And she was pardon? And I was oh, I didn't want to be weird about it, but I was oh, you're on your phone, you probably don't want to talk about it. And she looked at her phone and she was I honestly had no idea I was even doing that. She was I had no idea I was even on my phone. And she was still kind of semi-engaging in the conversation, but at the same time she was scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And I was and we both were sitting there being wow, that's just a complete, the presence of social media is just dulled your emotional response, and in some ways perhaps you're leaning on that in many situations without even realizing. Our phones are an emotional shield because they can pull us in with all their dopamine offerings and make us feel great and distracted in the moment but disconnected in the long run. Finally, one of the ways that we avoid feeling our feelings, my personal favorite, over-intellectualizing every emotion and rationalizing it to the 9th degree so that we never have to feel it. So let me explain the psychology behind why we do this. Psychologically, intellectualizing is linked to something called cognitive avoidance, where our brain is essentially trying to bypass distressing emotions by shifting focus to logic and reason, creating that kind of sense of detachment because our emotions are not sensations. They're not things that are happening to us. They're ideas. They're abstract concepts. I'll give you some examples of this. Going through a big breakup or your first heartbreak, and instead of grieving it, you might be obsessing over the psychology of attachment styles. You might be overanalyzing the entire history of your relationship, rationalizing exactly why it wasn't meant to be, being quite scientific and dissecting every little moment that you had together. You may also find that you overthink any kind of emotion that you're experiencing by saying, why do I feel this way? What's the psychological explanation? What's the science? What's the neurobiology? When is it going to go away? What's the timeline? Instead of just saying, this is uncomfortable, who cares why it's happening? I'll get through it. I'll say it again. I am very guilty of this. In fact, I think my podcast is a reflection and is evidence of how guilty I am of this because, I really did start the psychology of your 20s to break down the emotions I was experiencing in a rational, logical way, i.e. I was over-intellectualizing them, and I've definitely gotten better, but I do find it's quite an interesting thing that often people who are overthinkers and who feel really big emotions really lean into intellectual resources or research or articles or fact or science as a kind of emotional crutch so they don't actually have to feel the thing so intensely. And by doing this, what's actually happening is that our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for reasoning, is dominating over our limbic system, which processes emotion, basically dulling our emotional response and providing temporary release from emotional pain. Let's quickly talk about some other reasons for this detachment. Trauma is one of them. The emotions of the past are scary and terrifying and big, and sometimes we are afraid that if we open that door, you may not be able to close it ever again. especially since we are not taught, really in any capacity in school, in life, how to handle big, uncomfortable emotions. We can also experience emotional numbness because of our current environment or context. Maybe it's a particularly stressful period at work, at school, you're experiencing grief, heartbreak. Even when a situation is dangerous, people often emotionally shut down. It's why you see a lot of people experiencing long-term shock, even amnesia during war, during natural disasters. Our brain is like, we cannot handle this. If we were to feel this all at once, we would surely break. So to survive physically and mentally, let's just shut this off for a little bit. Finally, the reason you might be experiencing emotional blunting is because of certain medications that also can create this sensation. One of them being antidepressants. Now, this is not to fearmonger or scare you, especially if you are on any kind of antidepressant or considering it. I'm currently on 20 milligrams of Lexapro a day, and we have a complicated relationship, but overall, my Lexapro has helped me tremendously. But I have, however, noticed that whilst it makes those hard, distressing emotions less sharp and painful and biting, it does also make the good emotions feel a little bit less fulfilling. Like, I remember being in Paris last year and being like, wow, I've never been to Paris before, and this is beautiful, and there's the Eiffel Tower, and I was like, I'm trying to get there, like maybe I should be more excited. And I just couldn't get to the point of excitement that I knew maybe 3 years before I could have gotten to. It also means I don't get to the levels of depression I could have gotten to, so a win is a win. But for some people, they do find this quite difficult. So what exactly are the consequences of not being able to feel our feelings? The thing is, and I am going to sound like a broken record, but our emotions haven't disappeared. We just aren't listening to them. All the systems that make emotions possible are still there. It's still firing as usual. We have just wrapped them up in bubble wrap and layers of tape and said, okay, all fixed. It's better this way. We're just going to leave it as it is. But if you suppress something for too long, have a guess what's on the other side. It's a huge eruption. It's like a volcano. Perhaps we would even experience what we would classify as an emotional or mental breakdown, where one day there's that final straw, that final thing that cracks you, or your defenses slip, or something so intense happens you can't cope, and again, all the stuff that you have pushed behind the wall comes flooding in. We do not want to get to that point. Not just because it's paralyzing, but also because when that happens, it doesn't matter what you're doing, who you are, where you are, your whole world stops. It's like that quote, take a break before your mental health chooses when to take one for you. That's exactly what I'm describing here. Also, you're alive, you're human. This is part of the experience, is to feel, and feel very, very deeply. I think life is meaningless without that. So I want that for you, even if it's scary. I really do. I want you to have a full rainbow of human emotional experiences. So what exactly should we be doing to slowly get back to our emotions and feel them deeply and accurately? I'm so glad you asked. Thanks for asking. Stay with us. We're going to talk about it very, very soon. I think we need to begin this section by myth-busting what feeling our emotions is and is not, because if you haven't done it for a while, I think there can be a lot of hidden misconceptions that aren't particularly useful about the truth around emotional expression and emotional connection. Feeling your feelings, it is not being a slave to your emotions. It is not being excessively emotional in a way you cannot control. It is not a sign that you are weak or too sensitive. It is not a reflection of your strength or worth as a person. Feeling your feelings does not mean the end of peace and serenity. That is what your brain is trying to convince you, but we have to ignore it. Emotions do not equal unbridled chaos. Here's what feeling your feelings actually means. It means you are more connected to others. The love that you may feel for people is deeper, and you can fall deeper into your relationships with them. It means more joy and moments of real deep contentment. It means you can make beautiful art, write beautiful things, create beautiful things. Feeling your feelings also means more energy and focus in general, because you're not constantly using your finite cognitive resources to force something down that doesn't need to be suppressed. It also means you get to be more human. That's the biggest selling point for me. In my mind, I think accepting this and being like, okay, I'm prepared to feel my feelings is like the moment you're in these huge waves and this huge storm out at sea, and you've been fighting and fighting and fighting, and you are so tired from fighting and being rocked back and forth, and you slip under the water and you think you failed, only to realize like, oh my God, I can breathe under here. This whole time I could breathe under here, and wow, look at all this cool stuff. Like, it's beautiful under the water. That's really the metaphor that I love for this. So enough of that, no more metaphors. Here are my actual tips for feeling your feelings. Firstly, it goes without saying, go to a mental health professional if this is really, really intense, because they are going to dive into this for you in ways you cannot imagine and just give you so many fantastic, individualized, personalized recommendations and help and assistance. So that's your first step. But if you just want some more daily practices that you can do at the same time, well, I think firstly, you've got to stop telling yourself that you're just an emotionless person. There is literally no good that can come from that. No one is born that way. Seriously, tell me about a child who was born and didn't cry and didn't giggle or get fussy. Emotional reactions are hardwired into us. It's just that you maybe can't recall a time when your emotions were permitted. And considering many of us can't remember anything before the age of 3 because of something called infantile amnesia, if your emotions started being hushed and put down and scolded around that age or even earlier, of course you cannot remember a time when you had a serious connection to your emotions, because by the time you were making conscious memories, the damage was already done. So when you hear yourself saying, I don't feel my feelings that deeply, I'm not that sensitive, I'm quite cold, I'm just a cold person, I need you to ask yourself, how did you come by this realization? Who told you about yourself? Like, who made you believe that? And also, the fact that you're listening to this episode, my friend, that shows that you know it isn't true. Because you and your emotions obviously have a more nuanced and complicated relationship than that. So after acknowledging, yes, you are an emotional deeply feeling person, and that's okay, we need to get back in touch with the physicality of our emotions. Often, and this is according to research at Columbia University, which I love to quote, the first way we feel our emotions is physically. Think about when you were a child. Before you were taught to suppress these parts of you, you felt your emotions all over in your body, in your nerves, in your fingers, in your face, before you ever had a word for it. And there is this amazing study from the University of Alabama that talks about how most of us can name a physical sensation better than an emotion. So we need to start there. Try first by leaning into the embodied sensation of an emotion by asking yourself where in your body, on your body, this emotion tends to make itself known. There is an amazing resource that I personally love called the Emotion Sensation Wheel, and it was created by someone called Lindsay Brahman. Personally, I cannot recommend it enough. Basically, if you're feeling tense, if your hands are numb, your foot is tapping, your lip is cold, you're hot, you're shivering, you feel electric, whatever it is, where you feel something in your body, which is often what we notice first, you can trace that back to a feeling. So this is actually called a somatic check-in, and it's really an incredibly important tool. Honestly, when an emotion comes up, when you feel it in your body, give it a name, but also treat it like a game. Treat it like a challenge to collect your emotions, to feel as many of them as possible. Like Strava. I know this sounds strange to talk about like a running app that tracks your miles in an episode about emotion, but sometimes when I'm like, I shouldn't be feeling that, it's a bad feeling, I want to avoid this, I think No, it's like I've got some cool, like, stamp book or like a passport where I'm trying to collect all the emotions. Like, this is a game. I'm learning here. I'm collecting experiences that remind me that I'm human and that I'm alive and that my environment impacts me and that I can reach out and touch and feel everything. And I am here, and I don't know. It's moving and shifting into a place of wonder, but also having a beginner's mindset about it as well. If you're not at that stage yet, that's totally okay. If you're not at the stage but you still want to feel something, I want you to try a practice called a somatic release. I recommend a whole lot of tips of this on this podcast. I do 2 episodes a week. There's a whole lot of advice being given. But this one has to make my top 3 of the things I personally use. Somatic release, I'm going to use the Harvard definition here because I like it the best. Somatic release allows your body to express deeply painful emotions and experiences by using your body as a medium. If trauma is stored in the body, that's where it should be targeted. And somatic, by the way, I should say, is the Greek word for body. So, yes, essentially it's the release of emotion through the body. Somatic release could include something I like to call crazy dance. I love crazy dance. Whenever I'm feeling like really down or crap or numb, I put on a song in my headphones and I just move my body ridiculously. And I mean, that's the aim of the game, for it to look like a crazy dance. The song I'm loving for this right now is, I was like, should I make something up? No, I'm going to tell you the truth. It's Tambourine by Eve. And I need you to listen to that song and understand why. If you know what it is, you'll understand why I'm a bit that's a bit of an embarrassing song to say. But I love early 2000s music for my crazy dances. And I just find that anything I'm feeling in my body is so much better represented for me right now through that kind of expression. For other people, it's stretching, it's yoga, it's a practice movement or pattern of movements that they've made to really emotional and to really flow an emotion. It's running. It's anything that makes you feel in your body. If your favorite way to avoid feeling your emotions is to over-intellectualize them like me, talk therapy sometimes just isn't useful anymore because